run-of-river style projects that have very small head ponds. They have long, steep, and skinny penstocks, and they average about 10 megawatts in size. IPPs should continue to have an important place on our rivers and in our economy for the following 7 reasons. The run-of-river style of projects that IPPs focus on and do best has the lowest environmental impact of any form of power generation. BC Hydro is best known for its much bigger reservoir-style projects. Number 2, run-of-river IPP projects create jobs in rural areas where they are needed most. Number 3, run-of-river IPPs generate new revenues to government in the form of water rentals, school and property taxes, income taxes, and often payments to local governments. Run-of-river IPPs provide the most opportunities to First Nations in the way of jobs, capacity building, revenue payments, and equity involvement. IPPs do run-of-river projects cheaper than BC Hydro. And IPPs shield BC Hydro ratepayers and taxpayers from risks during the high attrition development phase and from projects that get hit with construction overruns. The private sector brings another hand on deck to help create BC's new green economy. This is especially true now that BC Hydro is busy with its own record level of capital expenditures and hiring plans. Contrary to allegations made during the recent campaign, there are many things that IPPs are not. IPPs are not new. BC's rivers are not being sold, and they are not gone forever. After 40-year lease is up, IPPs have no rights to the water. They are not permitted to export bulk water. BC Hydro has not been banned from new generation. BC's electricity system is not being rapidly privatized. BC Hydro is not forced to buy from only IPPs. IPPs have not sold any long-term electricity to the U.S. Exporting electricity is not a priority for IPPs. New IPP energy does not cost more than BC Hydro's new energy. There is not a gold rush of IPP projects that are actually getting built. IPPs cannot build until they get about 50 environmental permits. Projects under 50 megawatts are not excused from getting all those permits. Cumulative impacts are not ignored. First Nations are not opposed to IPPs. In fact, they're either doing them themselves or they're crafting what are called impact benefit agreements with IPPs. Local government and the public are not prevented from commenting on IPP projects. Run-of-river projects are not being built in salmon spawning channels. I could go on, but that's enough of what IPPs are not, at least until our rebuttal session of today's event. My main argument will focus on why IPPs, and specifically run-of-river projects, should continue to have an important role in our rivers and our environment. Thank you.
Thank you. The negative, Gwen Barlee, Policy Director, Wilderness Committee.
Thanks for coming out on a lovely night, and thanks to David Berner and Langara College as well as the sponsors. I'm here tonight to explain why private power isn't good for our rivers, our economy, or our environment. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Wilderness Committee. We're an organization that was founded 30 years ago in British Columbia around the kitchen table, and we're a grassroots organization that has 30,000 members and another 30,000 supporters. And we work to preserve biodiversity. We work to fight against climate change. We're working to introduce endangered species law in British Columbia. We're trying to stop urban sprawl, and we're working to protect the agricultural reserve lands also. But what I'll be discussing tonight is how I originally thought, the Wilderness Committee originally thought, that private power was the right solution for British Columbia. But upon digging deeper, we realized that environmental standards had been gutted in 2002 under the auspices of streamlining, that ministry biologists were pressured into signing off on projects, and that the Environmental Assessment Office was broken. And to give you an idea, last week we received a leaked document from the Ministry of Environment, and it showed that environmental standards had been lowered again, and Ministry of Environment managers were not allowed to say no to IPPs that didn't want to obey old growth management areas or wanted to log down to stream banks. And then yesterday, I got a Freedom of Information request on an IPP And it was 1,200 pages on environmental transgressions that had happened at this IPP. So we realized that there were real problems with environmental standards. And we also realized that the 2002 BC Energy Plan forbade BC Hydro from producing new sources of hydroelectricity. And you often hear that that's not the case, but I'm going to read out point 13 verbatim to you from the 2002 Energy Plan. And it says this: the private sector will develop new electricity generation, with BC Hydro restricted to improvements at existing plants. So the private sector will develop new electricity generation. And then following that up, this is a quote from Minister Neufeld when he was speaking to Scott Simpson with the Vancouver Sun. And he said this, verbatim: BC Hydro must be broken up and private sector companies given better access to the Crown Corporation's assets so that BC can participate in a rapidly evolving continental market for electricity. The Fort St. John MLA said the government now considers the proposed breakup of British Columbia's biggest Crown Corporation as a matter too urgent to be delayed until the release of the province's energy policy. And we're in the process of handicapping BC Hydro, which is our best tool for fighting climate change. And today, because of reliance on private power, we're on the hook, all of us, taxpayers and citizens across this province, for $30 billion in energy purchase agreements to private power companies for a small portion of our energy. And there's a much better way to spend $30 billion than that. With proper planning and public ownership, we can do green energy right. We can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions much more effectively. We can provide for BC's energy security needs and have money from public power flow back to public coffers. Thank you.
Comments, there was quite a number. I'll try to spend a bit of time on each one of them. At the question period, feel free to throw some of the ones up that I have overlooked. The first comment was really to do with BC Hydro and what is alleged to be a desire to break up BC Hydro. Certainly the IPP BC, the Independent Power Producers Association of BC, has never advocated breaking up BC Hydro. To my knowledge, neither is the government. In fact, in their heritage, BC Hydro Heritage Legacy Assets Act, they explicitly said that it is to be enshrined as publicly owned in law. So that is there. The second thing is with regard to the point about the energy plan and the restriction on BC Hydro. It does say restricted to improvements on existing facilities, but one just simply needs to look at the fact that BC Hydro owns and operates about 80% of the existing hydro facilities in British Columbia. So all they need to do is expand a few of them 10% at a time, and it's more than the entire IPP industry put together. We are only 10% of the generation market. BC Hydro is huge. And to give an idea of the impact of that, BC Hydro is currently spending about $350 million on expanding the Revelstoke project. They've spent $100 million on the Aberfeldy project. They have similar plans on the Michael projects. They have $1 billion worth of generation projects that are either underway or that are planned. They are still in the business of generating new electricity. The next point that Gwen mentioned was the $30 billion, and that, I haven't done the calculation, but it wouldn't be surprising to me that the cost of a 40-year contract for buying power from a number of IPPs is in that order of magnitude. But that order of magnitude of obligations is really no different than what would BC Hydro would have to the financiers of its own projects if it went out and raised money to build it. Whether it goes to an IPP or whether it goes to BC Hydro, it still needs to be financed. They play out over many years. The difference is rather insignificant. The next one is with regard to the Ashley project and the point about construction. I'm familiar with the project from a number of years ago, but my understanding of it is what they were trying to do at Asheville is make sure that people were protected. It is a large construction project. Large construction projects are dangerous. Keeping people away from dangerous equipment, especially tunneling and other similar equipment, is simply prudent. With regard to the size of the project, it's about a 45 megawatt project. It'll be producing power for the order of 300,000 people. These are big projects, and frankly, construction's a bit messy as you do it, but I urge all of you to take a look at existing operating projects. Once they're built, they're well fixed up afterwards. A quick point on the cumulative impacts. You just have to look at the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, Section 13, Section 16, and the projects that trigger that act, of which most of our IPP projects are, in fact, trigger the cumulative impact assessment. With regard to the gold rush, again, I simply bring up the point that 1,000 projects, 1,000 run-of-river projects have been identified over the course of 20 years, only 35 have been built. It frustrates me when people continue to focus on the 1,000, when in fact what really impacts British Columbians are the 35 or thereabouts that get built. Scaring people with numbers I don't think is helpful to the debate. Focus on what actually gets built rather than what simply gets investigated at the front end. Secondly, another point with regard to the allegation that we're expensive. BC Hydro was under testimony at the BC Utilities Commission in November, where they answered a very specific pointed question with regard to are IPPs driving up the rates of power in British Columbia, and explicitly and under testimony they said no. I think I'll cut it off at that point. Thank you.
All right, fair enough. Thank you.
I'd just like to get back to the point, sort of harp on it, in regards to IPPBC saying that BC Hydro is not prevented from producing new sources of hydroelectricity. Because I went back and pulled up an old IPPBC report from 2001, and it was the BC Electricity Market Reform Report. And it said, the recommendations were from IPPBC, BC Hydro should be precluded from directly or indirectly participating in the development of new generation, ensuring that the private sector provides for the future growth in BC's domestic electrical requirements. So that's from IPPBC's own report. And one of the things that I also want to talk about, you often hear that these projects are small, that they're under 10 megawatts or they're 5 megawatts. But the reality for many of these projects is far different. And I need to also explain one thing, that projects don't go through an environmental assessment process, the provincial one, unless they're over 50 megawatts. And so that means about 90% of projects don't go through. Sometimes they can be 49 megawatts like the Ashley or a little bit under. But I am going to talk about some projects and the problems associated with them. And one of them is Butte Inlet. And some people in this room might have heard of Butte Inlet. And it is a massive project that is being proposed by Plutonic Power and General Electric. And it is over 1,027 megawatts. It would see about 400 kilometers of new transmission lines. It would see the diversion of 17 rivers, taking up to 94% of mean annual flow. It would go through grizzly bear habitat. It is in salmon habitat. It is in fish habitat. That's one of the reasons why they're having a federal environmental assessment. And it's a massive, massive project, the largest private power project in Canada. Then you have another project that's planned for Glacier Hauser, and that's in the Kootenays. And it's also a big project, although not as big as the Butte Inlet. And what it's planning on doing that's really disturbing is it's planning on taking out water from the streams for the turbine, but the water never being returned to those streams. And then you have the Upper Pit. And the Upper Pit was a project that sort of became pretty well known last year. And there were stock market promoters and private power developers that we met with, and they want to put a private power project in an area that's one of the last wild salmon strongholds in the Lower Mainland. And because it saved them money, they wanted to put a power line through a provincial park, Homeburg Provincial Park. And so we said to them, we said, oh, that's not a go. That's not a go. That's a Class A provincial park that'll set a terrible precedent. And they said, why not? Nobody really uses that park. We could be in for a little bit of a problem. But the good thing is that people got together and they stood up together and they spoke out, and there was farmers and loggers and grandmothers and grandfathers and fishers and hunters in the public assessment meetings, public information meetings. And they said, we're putting our streams and our rivers, our public power and our wild salmon ahead of private profits. And so the Upper Pit was turned down, but only because of a massive public uproar. And then I'll just talk a little bit about Miller Creek. Miller Creek is a project that's up and running, and it's near Pemberton. And they had a malfunction about 18 months ago. And because when these projects are up and running, they're heavily automated. So oftentimes there can be no one at the plant. And so there was a malfunction at the plant, and water stopped flowing into the stream. And alarms went off, and nobody was at the plant, so nobody paid attention. And then alarms were rerouted to Edmonton, and nobody paid attention. And then farmers who lived downstream from the malfunction got up in the morning and saw that there was no water in Miller Creek. And then they phoned the company up and said, what the hell's going on? And that gives you an idea of what can happen with some of these projects. And we got leaked documents on the Miller Creek project because you have government biologists that are so incredibly concerned about the lack of standards for these projects across British Columbia. And it showed at the time that when this project was in the works, that government biologists said, no, I think this is going to be really detrimental to Miller Creek, and I don't think it should go ahead. And the government ignored those biologists. And one of the biologists actually was Marvin Rosenow. He doesn't work for government anymore. But he was known as being a very classy guy that would stand up for the environment. And you learn really quickly if you're a biologist in the Ministry of the Environment that if you stand up for the environment, there's danger involved. And what they said, what happened, so Marvin eventually had to leave the Ministry of the Environment because he stood up for wild salmon a few too many times and they shoved him out. And so they have a saying in the Ministry of the Environment, if you're standing up for environmental values, and they say, be careful not to get Marvinized, because that's what happens. And then just wrapping up, one of the things that needs to be brought up and addressed is some people think, and I think naively and perhaps well-meaning, that for every megawatt of low-carbon electricity that we bring online, it'll offset a megawatt of high-carbon electricity. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. And I'll give you an example of Highway 37. And Highway 37 is a proposal to electrify an area of northern British Columbia. And one of the biggest proponents behind Highway 37 to electrify this area of British Columbia is Donald McGuinness, who's the CEO of Plutonic Power. And he sells his power for about $80 to $100 a megawatt hour to BC Hydro, who are paying these overinflated prices. And then as a mining producer, he gets a really decent rate. He only has to pay about $40 a megawatt hour. He gets a massive, massive subsidy. And if the electrification of Highway 37 goes ahead with massive subsidies from electricity, it'll subsidize each mine to the tune of about $50 million a year, but it will also see 2 coal mines come on, Groundhog and Kaplan. And that will raise greenhouse gas emissions in northern BC by 1,200% in that area. And I'll close this with a quote, and this is from David Friedman. He was the chief energy advisor and the architect of deregulation, energy deregulation in California. And this is what he had to say about BC and BC Hydro. We just made a terrible mistake in California. We thought deregulation and competition were just inherently better than regulation and monopoly. It all sounded so good, but it turned out to be a dreadful mistake. The question I'm asking is, and this is where he's referring to BC Hydro, what is it that's broke with a system that's providing cheap, reliable electricity, that's paying sizable dividends to the government, that has a rainy day fund, and that has money available for new capital projects? It is basically utility heaven. There is an estate in the union that wouldn't give its IT for a power system like BC Hydro. What on earth is your government trying to improve?
Thank you again, David. Again, in closing remarks, in response to the resolution, we believe that private power should continue to have an important place on our rivers and in our economy, but not the only place. There should continue to be a mix of public and private sector efforts. To this mix, the private sector brings 7 things. The run-of-river style of projects that IPP focus on and do best have the lowest environmental impact of any form of power generation. BC Hydro is best known for its bigger reservoir-style projects. Number 2, run-of-river projects create jobs in rural areas where they're needed most. Number 3, run-of-river IPPs generate new revenues to governments in the form of water rentals, school and property taxes, income taxes, and often payments to local governments. Run-of-river IPPs provide the most opportunities for First Nations in the way of jobs, capacity building, payments, and equity involvement, as evidenced by the many impact and benefit agreements that have been signed by IPP companies and First Nations partners. Number 5, IPPs shield BC Hydro ratepayers from risks both during the high attrition development phase and from projects that get hit with construction overruns. IPPs do run-of-river style projects cheaper than BC Hydro.
You're a broken record.
And number 7, the private sector brings another hand on deck to help create BC's new green economy. This is especially true now that BC Hydro is busy with its own record level of capital expansion and hiring plans. But when it comes to harnessing the private sector to deliver essential service infrastructure, New York Governor Marion Cuomo eloquently stated, the private sector should row and the government should steer. In BC's electricity industry, the government steering is done through government ownership of the centrally dominant BC Hydro and also through extensive regulation. and BC's electricity sector is one of the most regulated industries in British Columbia. On the environmental side of regulation, every run-of-river project must get over 50 permits, licenses, approvals, and reviews from over a dozen different government agencies before it can start construction. Regardless of whether a project is over 50 megawatts or under 50 megawatts, each project must get the same permits and be held to the same standards. On the economic side, there are 4 economic regulatory considerations. First, BC Hydro is the only buyer of our product, so they have tremendous leverage to get low prices. Second, unlike most industries, this industry has an economic regulator, the BC Utilities Commission, and its mandate is explicitly to protect electricity ratepayers, and it does that by making sure that BC Hydro plans to buy the power it needs and no more. Third, the BCUC must approve every single contract between an IPP and BC Hydro, and it only approves those that it deems that are, in quotes, in the public interest. Fourth, there is intense competition at 3 levels, both between supply side and demand side programs, between public generation and private generation, and also between the almost 100 different competing IPP companies themselves. This keen competition keeps prices as low as possible, and the abundance of choice enables BC Hydro and the environmental review agencies to pick the best projects. This high level of regulation helps protect BC Hydro ratepayers, as well as BC's beautiful natural environment. To better understand these measures, please look at the facts, not the opinions, and certainly not the ideological-based opinions. The facts are easily found at bcuc.com, bchydro.com, and for environmental issues at the eao.gov.bc.ca. Take a look at those first before you listen to other arguments. But seeing is the best way of believing, and accordingly, I invite all of you, including especially Gwen, to do a tour of an operating run-of-river hydro project.
Go to Squamish instead.
IPPBC has put on many tours, and we've shown hundreds of people how these run-of-river projects work, and we're proud of them. But coming back to BC, so my summary is, private power has an important role, so does public power. We live in a mixed economy. We're not advocating that BC Hydro should disappear. We both have an important role to play. Thank you.
Thank
Just wrapping up, and before I get into my final remarks, I'll just have a couple rebuttals to Steve. One is that the Provincial Environmental Assessment Office is really broken. It was gutted in 2002, and standards were lowered. And it's only once ever recommended that a private power project not proceed, actually any industrial project not proceed. So it's really a green lighting process. And in regards to the BC Utilities Commission, they've been given their marching orders to make sure private power gets online and gets online quickly. And again, just in regards to, this isn't about deregulation, it is about deregulation, it is about privatization. And again, quote from Minister Neufeld, BC Hydro must be broken up and private sector companies given better access to the Crown Corporation's assets. And I have been to lots of private power projects, including some operating ones, Miller Creek. But one of the problems, of course, when you go up, at least with Miller Creek, the gates are closed so the public can't come in. So I was kind of on the outside knocking on the door, but no one came out. And then in closing, that BC is the envy of the world. We really have something special in this province. We have a public power utility that can provide for green, clean electricity for the people of this province. It can fight climate change, and it can return hundreds of millions of dollars annually to public coffers that we can use to build schools and libraries and engage in climate change initiatives and engage in investment in public transportation and retrofits. And so if we're serious about climate change, we must not handcuff BC Hydro from producing new sources of hydroelectricity. We must develop power by the public good rather than by the profit motive. We must include communities. We need to repeal Bill 30. We must plan wisely and carefully, retain public oversight, accountability, and ownership of an essential public resource, which is our rivers and streams and the power that they produce. And we also must stop the constant growth cycle. If we are serious about climate change, we won't go ahead with Gateway. And Gateway is a massive highway development project in the Lower Mainland. We need to maintain the moratorium on offshore oil and gas, which this government wants to lift. We need to say no to the Enbridge pipeline, which would see a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions from dirty tar sands oil pipe from Alberta. We need to say no to the electrification of Highway 37, which would increase greenhouse gas emissions by 1,200% through the production of 2 new coal mines, as well as many other mines in that area. But we need to say yes to democracy, planning, and public control over where and the power we produce. And I'll close with a quote by David Suzuki from his book, Metamorphosis. I believe that people, through government, must have control of their own natural resources so that public interest, not profit, sets policy. Thank you.